Okay, I'm back and I have another review, and today I am reviewing Behind the Shock Machine, The Untold Story of the Notorious Milgram Psychology Experiment by Gina. This book was published in April of 2012 by Scribe Publications. It has 432 pages and it has 30 ratings on Goodreads. I found out about this from NPR, and essentially either this is a documentary is based on this, or she wrote this after a documentary, but essentially there's a documentary in Australia about the Milgram experience that she produces or directs. Some background, if you aren't actually familiar with the Milgram experiments, what the Milgram experiments were done by Stanley Milgram in the summer of 1961, and what he did was he put out an ad and he tried to get as many blue-collar people as possible, mostly men, to participate in some experiments, and what he told them was an experiment in learning. And so when the people showed up, the guy would show up and there's another guy there, and they said that they were going to experiment with memory using shocks. And so there are two positions and they randomly draw, and one person gets to be the learner and the other person gets to be the teacher, and the teacher administers the shocks to the learner to help them improve their memory somehow to see if that will help them improve their memory in some sort of fashion. And so for every wrong answer that the learner says, the teacher is encouraged by the experimenter who is there observing the test to increase the voltage every single time there's a wrong answer and to administer a shock. Essentially, what it turns out to be, it is not an experiment on learning, but it's ultimately an experiment on obedience. And ultimately, it goes from shocks from 15 volts to 450 volts. And on the machine it just goes XXX. And the learner is not actually a volunteer, the learner is just a actor. And how people perceive or remember the experiments is that the learner goes into a separate room, and as they increase the shocks and as the learner gets the answers wrong, the teacher would start hearing screams like, "Ow, that hurts, please stop, I want to stop." And as the voltages increase, the pleas and the cries to stop the experiment get worse ultimately until the point that you stop hearing from this guy anymore, and the teacher is possibly to assume that the person is dead. And so this experiment was really an experiment in obedience, and to see how far a person will go doing something that obviously is hurting another person, but how far would they go doing it because someone tells them to in an experiment. What this book does, it examines that experiment again. It looks at Stanley Milgram's background. It looks at all the records. She tracks down people who were a part of the experiment, how they reacted to this experience. She talks to students of Milgram, people who had participated in some of his other experiments, and she also talks to some of the people who were family members of the actors, also talks to some of the critics, just a whole bunch of people around this experiment. And also she finds the actual recordings of all these people. This book was really interesting in the fact that it sheds some light on some aspects of the experiment that we no longer really emphasize anymore. When the experiment first came out, there were quite a few ethical concerns, and also the parallels that a lot of people were thinking about at the time. Since Stanley Milgram is Jewish, also at the time of these experiments there were Nazi trials, and people are trying to figure out this person that is supposed to be a Nazi, and they see like this kind-looking old man, and they're trying to wonder how this seemingly nice person, could have ultimately done horrific crimes during World War II. So what Stanley Milgram was going to try to set out to prove is the banality of evil, that there is a capacity for any average Joe Schmo to ultimately be a guard in a death camp. in any place and any time. Ultimately, for anyone to just be complicit in a genocide or a Holocaust just because authority tells them to. But ultimately, Gina Perry, she kind of re-examines and looks at these experiments from a different perspective, kind of shows that our perception of these experiments might be a bit skewed because we're only thinking of it in certain terms, and how Milgram himself possibly had some bias in his interpretation of the results and in his interpretation of some people. This book is done in like a journalistic style. She writes about arriving at the airport, or meeting people, her impressions of people, what she's thinking, how she feels listening to all these tapes. Some people might not like the journalistic style. I wasn't too keen on the journalistic style because it kind of felt like the conclusions and the thoughts and the arguments weren't as concise as I would have liked them to be, and as I'm used to in a nonfiction book. Anyway, that is my review of The Shock Machine. 3 out of 5 stars. It was good, but I just didn't really jive with the journalistic style. I felt it was a little bit messy. Not like too messy, but just not as concise as I would like it to be with all the arguments. So that is my review. I hope you guys liked it. Talk to you guys later. Bye!